Sorry, I got distracted by an email. And then it said it was part of a movement that wanted to avoid subjective emotionalism and embrace a set of traditional principles. And neoclassicism is something that was pervasive across art, across architecture, across music, and across writing. And writing and literature is how we're going to be dealing with it in this class. So it was, to kind of distill that, it was very paint by numbers in a way, but they didn't necessarily view that as being bad. They wanted to react to some of the movements that had come before that they thought were excessively overdone and excessively emotional, and they were like, we need to bring things back and make them simpler and adhere to classical forms and classical ideals of, this is how many lines a poem should have. Every painting that you do should embody the golden mean. Every piece of architecture needs to have lines going like this and like this, basically rules, embracing rules and structure and, emulating the people who came before. So Romanticism, which comes about in the 1800s, because, there is nothing new under the sun. Everything is just kind of a pendulum swinging back and forth in reaction to the thing that happened before it. Romanticism is a movement that reacts to the strict ideals of neoclassicism. Kind of like in America in the 50s, the culture was very conformist, and there were a lot of very strict rules about what you were supposed to do and what not do, and dress a certain way, and get a certain washing machine, and everybody was aspiring to the same thing. Then the 60s come and we have this massive counterculture movement that's very much about art and sex and drugs and rock and roll. The Romantics were kind of like those hippies. Very much so, actually. But they predated them, and it was a lot of the ideas that the Romantics came up with that ended up later inspiring the hippies, and that still inspire us today. And so one of the things I talked about at the beginning of this class is that we can trace many of the ideals that we hold culturally to this time period and to these people that were writing in it. And they influenced us in ways that we may not initially understand. So Romanticism, not romance as in giving people flowers at Valentine's Day, but Romanticism with a capital R, was a movement that was characterized by 5 things. And I have also posted that in the Discord. So if you open up the server, there is a PDF, and it says Characteristics of Romanticism chart. And I'm going to just go ahead and tell you right now that there will be a question on the test about neoclassicism and what it is. And one of the test questions is literally just going to be, list the 5 characteristics of Romanticism. And here's the chart. Here's the chart where that is. So if you want to download that, you can, but it will remain in the Modern British Literature channel. So when people started leaning into this new way of making art and music and poetry and thinking, these were 5 characteristics that emerged that made the Romantic movement what it is. So the first one, as it says there, is interest in the common man and childhood. From a Puritan perspective, because you remember there was a period where Puritans were in control in England after they overthrew their king, Charles, and they beheaded him, and the Puritans were actually in charge for a while. So from a Puritan perspective, children were to be seen and not heard, right? People didn't really think that anything of value could possibly come from a child. The Romantics believed that children could actually be quite wise. And Wordsworth in particular, and we'll talk more about him, but he's one of the main 6 Romantic poets, and he believed that everyone had immortal souls, and that children could remember better what it was like to be one with God, or whatever. His concept of God was different than maybe yours might be or that mine might be, but that the older we got, the less we remembered that divinity, but that to him there was something really special and almost holy about kids. So that they were actually to be listened to, and that sometimes that they said really oddly, weirdly wise things. So they believed in the power of childhood, and they believed it was something special, and that it should be preserved and protected. And that is going to come up with William Blake, because he had a lot of arguments against the child labor laws. Well, not the child labor laws, but the fact that children were being forced into labor in London, doing things like chimney sweeping or coal mining, because there were not any laws back then at that time to protect them. So they also believed in the common man. Before the Romantics, your value as a person was often determined by what strata of society you were born into. And if you were just a poor farmer, a lot of people would think this person has nothing of value to say. The Romantics turned that around on its head, and they were like, that's not necessarily true. We can get wisdom from anybody, and sometimes especially from these people who haven't been corrupted by civilization and society. And that is the whole reason why we have the Grimm's fairy tale stories. All those fairy tales that later became Disney movies, pretty much, from the early years, not recently, but were originally Grimm's fairy tales. And the reason why the Grimm's brothers did that is they went out into the countryside and interviewed country people to collect their stories that had been handed down through generations, because they were Romantics and they believed that the common man had something important to say. So that's the first one, is interest in the common man in childhood. The second one is strong senses, emotions, and feelings. And I'm just going to read this part. Romantics believe that knowledge is gained through intuition rather than deduction. This is best summed up by Wordsworth, who stated that all good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. That is a huge departure from the neoclassicists, who were like, if you're going to do something in the realm of art with a capital A, you have to be extremely intentional. You have to adhere to previously established forms. You have to do this, 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 and this. It has to have this many lines. It has to have this many, beats per measure, and all of that stuff. And then you have Wordsworth out here saying, no, poetry is just the spontaneous overflow of feelings. That is radical to them at that time. Today, that is pretty much how we think of poetry more. But back then, this was actually quite rebellious, to put more emphasis on feelings and intuition than deducing and learning from the world around you. The third one, and this is actually probably the biggest main influence on our society today, is the awe of nature. Romantics stress the awe of nature in art and language, and the experience of sublimity through a connection with nature. Romantics rejected the rationalization of nature by the previous thinkers of the Enlightenment period. If you had me for early British literature, we talked about this a little bit when we discussed Beowulf and, how important it was to have an established boundary around your home, and that was part of your masculinity in that society, that if you could not keep that boundary, you were totally emasculated and worthless. And that's why the dragon, goes crazy at the end, is not because of a cup, it's because he has been shamed, because he couldn't keep that boundary of protection. In previous ancient societies, there was a much bigger difference between inside and outside than there is for us today. I mean, sitting here in Tennessee right now, the main difference is air conditioning, because it is hot, and I'm tired of it. But we can pretty much go in or outdoors without thinking that we're going to be taking our life into our hands. Before we had these carefully established civilizations, going outdoors was taking your life in your hands. You didn't know if you were going to catch pneumonia or starve or get taken down by a saber-toothed tiger or neighboring raiders, Vikings, anything could happen out there. So people didn't really like the outside as much as a concept as we do now. It was all about creating shelter, establishing the comfort of your home and your domicile indoors. And they wouldn't really go around, paying attention to trees or waterfalls or anything like that, because it just wasn't something that they were societally geared toward noticing. It's like if somebody, this is, okay, I don't know why this is on my dresser. It's clean, don't worry. But, this is a waste bag for a dog when you're walking a dog and you have to use it to pick up his stuff, okay? If somebody wrote, a 14-line sonnet about the beauty of this waste bag and how the plastic crinkles and how it feels so smooth beneath your thumbs and the beauty of the cactus pattern, you would think that person was either off their rocker or just, having a go, just making fun. Because to us, it's this is not really worth singing about. This isn't really worth making art about. That's how they felt about trees. That's how they felt about the outdoors, because it not only was it beneath their notice, but it traditionally had kind of been an enemy to them. Nature was not their friend. Nature wasn't something that they held hands and sang kumbaya over. It was something they tried to survive. So the Romantics were the first people really ever in Western society to say, hey, number one, nature is worthy of our notice. It is beautiful. Like, stop and look at that tree. Stop and look at that river. Stop and look at that mountain. And number two, not only is it worthy of our notice, it is worthy of our protection. Because at this point in England, there was a lot of pollution happening. This was during the Industrial Revolution, and they were completely screwing up nature. I mean, the city was famous for being so foggy and smoggy that you couldn't see 5 feet in front of you. It was really gross at that time. London's kind of always been really gross. But the Romantics were the first people to say, we need to actually appreciate the nature around us. And we do this all the time. Like, 75% of your friends' Instagram posts are like, having a lake day, or hashtag blessed, look at this view. Like, that kind of mindset wouldn't have existed before these guys chose to focus on nature as a reason to be inspired creatively. The fourth one is celebration of the individual. Romantics often elevated the achievements of the misunderstood, heroic individual outcast. Ideally, you were supposed to be more of a collectivist during the neoclassicist times. It's all about, what is good for my church? What is good for my community? What is good for, for God and our country and our nation and so on and so forth. If, somebody was acting in a way that wasn't the norm, maybe they needed to be burned at the stake. I don't know, just an idea, just a thought. That was kind of the prevailing reaction back then. Or just bullied at the very least. Romantics were the first people who looked at the outcast archetype, the person who doesn't fit in with everybody else, and kind of idolized that person. Like, manic pixie dream girls or whatever. Like, ooh, if they're not fitting in with the crowd, maybe there's a reason for that. Maybe they're actually really cool and we should pay attention to what they have to say. In America, the movement that was inspired by Romanticism is called Transcendentalism. Now, you may have studied that in high school. You probably studied people like Whitman. And I believe it was Thoreau who has that famous quote about the man who hears the beat of a different drummer. And how that is somebody who should be left alone to do what he wants to do, but also should be maybe hearkened to. So, celebration of the individual. And the last one is the importance of imagination. Romantics legitimized the individual imagination as a critical authority. In the past, again, they might have thought of imagination as something that was just a useless distraction or even a temptation of Satan or something. And again, all art was supposed to be based on pre-established forms. What did the people before you do? Follow in that path. Follow these rules. Emulate these structures. Don't have any critical thought. Don't do that. That's dangerous. The Romantics were like, ooh, did you have an idea? That's exciting. Do that. Who cares what the other people did before you? So they really, really emphasized imagination as this almost magical, supernatural force. And you're going to see later with Coleridge about how, they believed that if you could really harness your imagination fully, it would almost make you godlike. So those are the 5 things that make Romanticism what it is. And many of those, as you can see, kind of hints still exist in our culture today. Those are still things that people hold on to. They just don't realize that they come from this squad of writers and musicians and artists in the 1800s. The main people that we are going to be looking at in this class, as we study Romanticism in this first unit, are Byron, and he's who we're going to be starting with, because we have to cover a play, we have to cover some kind of drama in a literature class, and he wrote a play called Manfred that we're going to be reading. I'm also going to show you a couple of his poems, and also because he's my favorite. So there's that. Number 2, in no particular order, William Blake. He was the first one. He kind of predated the rest of them. William Wordsworth, Samuel Coleridge. The 2 of them were best friends. John Keats, and Percy Shelley. So all those guys. we are going to be looking at for the Romantics units. Those are kind of the big six. When people talk about the Romantics, it's poetry-wise, it's those dudes. So we're going to start with Byron. But for today, all I need you to do is, again, kind of look back over that chart. And there is a discussion prompt in the discussion prompts channel that I need you to look at and just answer. So I just need you to think about these concepts and answer honestly and as thoroughly as you can the discussion prompt. You don't actually have a quiz or anything for today, and there's no homework assignment that you have to prepare. We're just kind of slowly kind of dipping into the Romantics before we really start getting going with Byron and Manfred the week after. So if you have any questions, let me know, but that's kind of the... Sorry, that was my dog groomer. That's kind of the introduction into Romanticism and what it is, and that's where we're going to be beginning, is kind of near the beginning of the 1800s for modern British literature. After we talk about Manfred and all the Romantics, we will be sliding into Frankenstein, because Mary Shelley was married to one of them. She was married to Percy Shelley. And then we will slide on into the Victorians, and then you will take the actual modern part of the literature at the end, and that'll be something you'll be researching a little bit. So if you have any questions, just let me know. I am sorry for the ratchitude of this delivery and not having a big fancy PowerPoint, but I would rather get it to you on time and have it be not fabulous than make you wait. So if you need me, let me know. Feel free to always, chat with each other in general chat if you need to. If you just need to ask college questions, I'm here. If you again, if you want to post memes or anything else, all I ask is that you keep it PG-13 or below for our dual enrollment friends. And I hope that your first few days of classes have been going well. I hope it hasn't been chaotic and that you feel like you got a pretty good grip on the beginning of the semester. Like I said, if you need me, don't hesitate to reach out via RaiderNet email or Discord message. So I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Again, your only job, now that you've watched this video, is to go into the discussion prompts channel, and by next Tuesday, a week from today, answer that discussion prompt. So, have a great rest of your day. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your patience for the 17 minutes. And make good choices, be safe, and I will see you again next week.